So what is the hip shift in a squat? Well, the hip shift happens when we start to shift towards one side in the squat. Now here's an exaggerated version of a hip shift towards my left. And a lot of times that tends to happen when we get towards the hardest part of the squat, right around this parallel position. So what is happening when we're doing a hip shift is that we tend to have asymmetries in availability of range of motion here at the hips, the ankles, the orientation of the pelvis, and the ability for the different bones of the pelvis, that being the innominate and the sacrum, to move on top of each other, and low back mobility as well. So again, if we're doing a squat, the heavier we load it, typically we see more hip shifting occur. So if someone is susceptible to a hip shift, the heavier they go and the deeper they go into a squat, the more we might see either a subtle shift towards one side or a more exaggerated shift towards one side. Also, you'll notice that we might get this hip shift just at this 90-degree angle portion, or it might be only when we start to push back out of that hole where we start to emphasize one side more than the other to get that work done. Again, all these things tend to show an asymmetry in range of motion. Maybe there's an injury history, but we also might have a little bit of a emphasis to produce power on one side more than the other. And again, that could come from an asymmetry and available internal rotation range of motion, or even a foot orientation issue where we might have a flared foot and we might be lacking ability to pronate on one side and then put weight into that side. So if we're lacking that on our left side, we'll tend to shift into our right side when we really need to produce power and come up out of that hole. So what are some of the range of motions that we might look for? One would be hip internal rotation. How we test this is laying down. I want you to bring your thigh perfectly to 90 degrees here, and then we want to bring our foot towards the outside. So through here like this. Now we want to get as much range of motion here as we can without letting our hip or thigh start coming in towards the midline. Now we'd expect at least 30 degrees, hopefully 45 degrees of internal rotation. And if we try that same thing on the opposite side, what we want to do is we want to see symmetry between both sides. If you notice one side is more difficult, you're not getting as much range, then we know there's an asymmetry there, and that might lead towards a hip shift towards the side with more range of motion. We also want to test external rotation. Same thing here, but now our foot's going to come towards the midline, and our thigh is going to externally rotate. Again, test this on both sides and see if there is an asymmetry from one side to the other. This will be the side that we are more comfortable shifting away from or pushing towards the other side. We'd also like to test ankle dorsiflexion. What we're going to do here is measure a distance from a wall to our foot, hopefully 4 or 5 inches. What we do from here is keeping our hip perfectly straight. Is we're just going to place our knee towards that wall without letting this heel come off the ground. Again, we're going to measure this on both sides and see if there's any difference or a big asymmetry or major restrictions on either side. So we're testing and measuring about 4 to 5 inches from the wall. Pick 4 to start. Keep your foot fully flat on the ground. Don't let your hips shift from side to side. Keep them perfectly straight. And then try to bring that knee towards that wall without letting that heel come off the ground. Another very important idea here, or concept, is the anterior tilt. So something we need to be aware of is our orientation here at the pelvis. So you can see here, if my belt line is tilted down and pointing downward like this pelvis is in a anteriorly tilted position, and my low back is probably going to be in a big extended position here. What we want is for that belt line to come back neutral like this, creating a neutral pelvis. The orientation of the pelvis, if it's neutral, it allows us to sit straight down into a squat. So again, if I have access to a neutral pelvis and I create a neutral pelvis, I can squat straight down. If I'm stuck in an anterior tilt, that pelvis is tilted forward, and I'm still going to squat straight down, but in this case, down is going to be slightly down and back. So now the squat, the hips have to come backwards. Now from here, I have to counterbalance. So if my weight starts to shift backwards in the squat, I now have to hinge more up top to keep my center of mass over the midfoot. Again, so that creates a compensation where we're starting to hinge more in the squat. Now that's the sagittal plane. So if I have an anterior orientation that's more pronounced on one side of the pelvis, then we can start getting asymmetries which start to show up in that frontal plane, which again is that side-to-side hip shift. So if I have one side of the pelvis that's slightly more flexed and one that's a little bit more extended, and I'm a little bit more anteriorly tilted on that one side, we can create a hip shift to one side compared to the other, right? And there's some more tests that we can do to see the orientation of the pelvis on one side relative to the other, and that requires more hands-on work, but again, that adds to the story. So what I really recommend is coming in and getting evaluated where we can do all these tests, put the story together, find out where there's some orientation issues at the pelvis, and then we come up with a plan to start working on some of that range of motion while retesting and bringing you back into squats to get that squat where we don't necessarily have to hip shift anymore, whether it's due to a range of motion issue or a power production issue or a past injury that's trying to keep you off that side.